Well, ladies and gentlemen, we do have an interesting little story here when it comes to the future of US elections with electoral votes and how those are given out. And will we potentially see a change by the 2028 election before the 2030 census? This has been something that I've kept up on. I recently saw this huge Trump's administration can try to fix the 2028 electoral map by fixing the 2020 census, which undercounted red states. He needs to immediately ensure illegals also are not counted in the 2030 census. So there's a few different things at play here. Now, this article in specific is behind a paywall, but I am going to give everyone my take on, as you can see, when it comes to this is the forecast for 2030. When it comes to electoral votes and how they're changed based off of the population changes, it happens whenever the census updates, which is every 10 years. So in 2000, in 2010, in 2020, the 2024 election was the first year we used the updated 2020 numbers. And we're seeing a common shift every 10 years, especially in 2020. And with where we are now with populations in 2024, we are seeing a shift out of the bigger blue states like a California, like an Illinois, like a New York, and into the red states, the newly red Florida, and also states like Texas, as well as a state like Idaho. And as you can see, this is just a projected 2030 map based off of late 2023. So this was done in December of 2023. Obviously, there's still 7 more years, but this is what it would look like if we recounted everything right now. This would be the projected estimate to where you have Texas gaining population, possibly gaining a few electoral votes. You've got Florida gaining potentially 2, 3, maybe 4 electoral votes. Georgia would get an electoral vote. Tennessee, doesn't surprise me, with Nashville would get an electoral vote as well. North Carolina would get an electoral vote, and you'd have Illinois, you would have California. Obviously, a lot of this from the census. Number one, the census, the way it was done was a total mess because they were doing the census during the pandemic. And then you've got the whole thing to where they also count the illegals in terms of giving out the proper electoral votes per state. Also, when it comes to the congressional races, the illegals are factored in, which is totally ridiculous considering, at least liberals tell us, that only legal citizens vote. Well, then why are illegals counted as to states' power? Why would illegals in New York be counted towards giving them more electoral votes because they're part of the population, but they can't vote? So that makes no sense. Now, the thing about this is the only way Trump, outside of maybe some type of maybe there's something that Trump can pull because of the craziness in 2020 and the way things were counted. Maybe there's something to where you can update the census before 2028, because the way it's looking right now, it's going to be the exact same electoral votes going into 2028. And it was actually, from what I saw and what I remember, this happened right before the election. I was watching a podcast, I think it was Ben Shapiro. He said that even with the craziness, with all the illegals being counted and everything, they still miscounted or misallocated electoral votes. 2 more electoral votes should be Republican, and the Democrats should have 2 less, based on the electoral votes not being allocated properly. I know Florida was definitely one of the states that should have 1 more electoral vote, and then it was another pretty Republican state that should also be given another electoral vote, and then it was 2 deep blue states that should have had their electoral votes taken from them. And so it was just inaccurate, even if you added everything together with the illegals involved. So even with the illegals, they still miscounted it by 2 electoral votes. So that's a 4 electoral vote shift. And that's something that Trump potentially could challenge. And that's exactly what he would have challenged if the liberals would have ran their blue wall, which is winning, the 3 states, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan, losing every other swing state, losing the entire Sun Belt. They're at 270, Republicans are at 268, but because they misallocated the electoral votes, it really should have been Trump. Even with her winning the entire blue wall, Harris, Trump would have been at 270 anyways. And obviously now with this map, if they win the blue wall, it wouldn't. You could win the blue wall with a map like this if the electoral votes updated like this, to where New York lost 3, California lost 4. I mean, those are 2 red really blue states. That's losing 7 electoral votes. And by the way, is this really all that surprising that these states are losing them based off of the mass population shifts we saw in 2021 because of the pandemic? Now, there are liberals that are coping and saying, well, California's getting people back. But with those prices, they're still very likely going to lose at least 3 electoral votes by 2030, you would think, at least 2. And you've got states like Texas and Florida profiting off of that and really getting people in there. And we saw Texas, even with the migration from California, making Austin the new blue capital. It didn't even matter. I mean, Trump won Texas by way more than any of us would have thought, by like 13 or 14 points. So there's a lot at play here. If Trump wanted to, based on everything that I know, if Trump wanted to try and get this recounted just in general, because you could argue, well, maybe there's some type of exception because of how badly the counting was done in 2020 with the crazy pandemic, the once in a century pandemic. You could say because of that, it was counted improperly. It needs to be recounted. Normally, there's really no way to get this stuff recounted until the census updates again in 2030 without changing an amendment, which is not going to happen. So I'm wondering what Trump can really do. I mean, it was already miscounted anyways. Republicans should have 2 more electoral votes. Democrats should have 2 less. That was an error within the census and the electoral votes. That we know. And so if you've got something like that, and you've also got the illegals being counted, certainly if you're Trump, there's stuff that has to be done when it comes to, I bet you most people don't even know that that's a thing. I mean, think about how crazy that is and how much liberals will gaslight you into illegals don't vote. What are you talking about? Well, then why do they help give certain states more power? Because that's what's going on here. If there's a bunch of illegals in California, they might give them an extra electoral vote because they're counted in the census. So why does that make any sense? Why would California need more electoral power because they've got a bunch of illegals in their state? That's another thing that needs to be looked at. And so there's a lot of stuff really at play. But I mean, if this stuff happened to where Illinois is losing electoral votes, Minnesota loses an electoral vote, you know, you've also got Arizona. And by the way, it looks like Arizona is going to be more of a Republican state now. Nevada, which went red. Idaho is definitely gaining population. You know, these are Republican states that are, I mean, you've even got Rhode Island losing an electoral vote in this situation when it comes to it. So if this ends up, you know, we'll see what happens with Trump. But the idea is it's going to update in 2030, and this may change. It might shift because we know what happened during the pandemic. You had a bunch of people move out of the blue states and move into the red states, and maybe they'll move back. Maybe some of them will. But this is something we've seen now for even before the pandemic. That's why when they did the 2020 update in the census, California, I think, lost an electoral vote, and Texas might have gained 2, or Florida, I think Florida also gained 1. So this has been going on. It accelerated because of the pandemic, and that made even more people leave California. But you're going to see in the 2030 census, very likely, less electoral votes for California, New York, and Illinois, and more electoral votes for Florida and Texas, which is very good in terms of the electoral math for Republicans. And I would also expect Idaho to add at least 1 more electoral vote as well. And you're looking at Oregon potentially losing a little bit, you know, possibly 1 electoral vote in this when it comes to it. But I mean, listen, can Trump actually do something? I mean, maybe he can. Maybe there's some type of an exemption because you're counting illegals. You could certainly look into doing something about that. And then when it comes to, you know, fixing the map for 2028, because it was counted so poorly, because of the one in a century pandemic, that's when they did the census in 2020 during that entire mess. There could potentially be a way for Trump to have everything recounted properly and more accurately by saying that and challenging and making it illegal. If you're able to make it illegal to where you have a law that says no, illegals cannot count towards giving states electoral power, because that's what happens if there's a bunch of illegals in California and all of those illegals add up to giving California 1 more electoral vote, that state gets more electoral power. So if Trump can pass a law like that, then everything must be redone. And if everything gets recounted and you get an update in 2025 or 2026, oh my goodness, you're going to see California lose electoral votes. You're going to see New York lose electoral votes. You're going to see Illinois probably lose at least 1 electoral vote. You're going to see Texas probably gain 1, Florida gain 1 if they recounted, you know, in 2025 or 2026. But I think the way you would do that would be making it illegal to have illegal immigrants count towards electoral power with each of these states. That's probably what you would do. But in general, when it comes to how they update these things, it's every 10 years. And if you were to change the counting system and say, oh, we want to do an update in 2025, unless Trump can do something and pass another law like making it illegal to count illegals in it would need a constitutional amendment, I believe. So listen, we'll see what happens. Obviously, if you're Republicans, you want to get an update on all these numbers because these numbers look great, especially in 2021 with the shift that we saw out of California with many people and also the shift out of New York. Those states, undoubtedly, if you did an update right now, would lose electoral votes. But technically, based off of how we do it, those states will not lose electoral votes until 2030, meaning it wouldn't impact the 2028 election. It would impact the 2032 election, but not 28. So, we'll see if Trump's able to do anything when it comes to this. I mean, if they seriously did, because there were legitimate people saying that they just straight up miscounted the census and the population relative to electoral votes per state, that needs to be changed. Okay, that's it. Because honestly, even if those two electoral votes gets changed, liberals can't even run with the whole blue wall scenario because if they won the blue wall, they'd only be at 268. So, minimum, they need to try and change that because that's legitimately miscounted. You have to change that. That's ridiculous. And so Trump needs to push for that with all the power he has right now. But either way, guys, that is going to do it for this video. Make sure you follow me on X. Link to that's always in the description.